interesting results back in the upper window, and seems like we have 8 people that know what or think that they know what net neutrality is, and 4 people that are not sure. But we don't have anyone who would say that he or she doesn't know what net neutrality is, which will make our today's discussion much simpler, I hope. So, okay, let's start. I hope you can hear me well. Welcome to another IG webinar, the Internet Governance webinar, done in cooperation of Diplo with the Geneva Internet platform. It's interesting to note, and we just realized it a couple of days ago, that the first webinar of the IG series that we do, now we do it monthly, at last week of each month, the first webinar, which was exactly 3 years ago, was on net neutrality. So we started 3 years ago on net neutrality, and we are in a way repeating ourselves now. We'll try to move the discussion onwards, of course. I'll go through a number of slides as a kind of an update, an introduction, and a reminder of what net neutrality aspects are there, and then move on the updates of what's happening in the policy space in developments, and then we'll move to questions. Of course, feel free to pose the questions at any points. Just type it in the chat and add question or comment, and then we'll go afterwards through all the comments and questions and try to discuss and clarify and see different perspectives. Now, I'll start with briefly reminding of what different aspects of net neutrality are, and then we'll move to developments. So, what are the main developments? We'll touch upon the implications for developing countries, because that's something that's becoming and has always been very important. We'll try to sum up on a couple of open issues that still we have disagreements about, and then we'll maybe look at what comes, what are the prospects of the discussion in the next period. So briefly about net neutrality, since I see most of you think that you know what net neutrality is about, I'll just run through the illustration that we did a couple of years ago. It might need some improvements at this point, but basically, let's go bit by bit. Firstly, as the traffic flows through the internet service providers, and those are the ones we are connected to, basically the internet service providers and telcos are to some extent the gateways, our gateways to the internet. Now, they might have the option, and they've in a way already been doing that since the beginning of the internet, to give certain priority to certain types of packages and make them move faster, and the others move slower. It was particularly the case about the specific types of content like video, audio, and so on, while the email and text forms can be a little bit late. We'll get back to specific types of prioritization of content. Then, as we can have the fast lane and the slow lane as it's typically discussed, the fast lane can push some of the priority packages, while the slow lane can simply pick up all the packages that are considered to be of the lower priority, and the decision can be made, of course, by the gateways or the internet service provider. There's a different question whether internet service providers as gateways should be also doing the work of gatekeepers, but it's a totally different discussion. As the packages flow on two different lanes, fast lane and slow lane, here is what happens, or what might happen around the world on the user end. And that's probably the biggest concern, of course, for users, but for all of us. On one hand, in the developed world, where there is quite a sufficient broadband, not always, mobile connections and 3G and wireless can be congested also, but we can consider that probably most of the packages will arrive to end users with more or less good quality of service, even though that's one of the discussions. In developing world, however, the connections are not as good, and with limited bandwidth, it can happen that some of the fast lane reach out to the users, while the slow lane, to some extent, can become congested, and the quality of service in case of slow lane packages and traffic can be problematic, and maybe even people might not be able to use it practically speaking. We'll get back to the consequences on developing world. So we have basically gone through this upper or middle layer of the illustration. Let's move a little below, and below we have mostly civil society user communities, but also a large number of content providers or over-the-top OTTs, as I usually refer to, which raise the question or raise the concerns about different lanes, or what can happen if this prioritization is done with discrimination. We'll get back to that. So what can happen is if we have certain types of traffic flowing faster and certain type of traffic flowing slower, it can happen that, for instance, if Google or YouTube or Facebook or the local services of the telecom providers go faster, the others, like small websites, new services emerging around the world, can become slower or even unusable. And that's where we have the cases of discrimination, possibility of lack of freedom of choice for different services, a need for education services which might also need priority, maybe, why not, even though they might not be able to pay for it. A chance for people with disabilities that also need particular services which might require higher bandwidth or specific priority as well. Requests for openness, for innovations in services, so that some new Facebook or new Twitter can occur without a need to have huge lumps of money to invest, right? They can just have a good idea and start, as it was the case in all the days before with the new services on the internet. Now, as we move to the left, we see the entrepreneurs and OTTs or service providers. The big service providers, in a way, can rethink this and can say, okay, we are so big currently, like Google or Facebook, we are so big now that we can even afford to pay for priority. So some of them might even be turning to partnership with telecoms and saying, okay, we're going to pay, but we get the priority for our content. As we go left, we see that the telcos now might be charging for the priority content, so that basically they can decide based on the revenue and economic interest which type of traffic can become priority and which cannot be priority. Now, the telecoms have a very, so to speak, a valid argument. They need to invest in the network in order to rebuild the networks, to improve the bandwidth, to build up new roads or new cables. They, of course, as we see over there, to build the capacity for the next billion, including the mobile services, to introduce new services, to improve backbone, to introduce or to maintain quality of service, they, of course, need investment in the network. And the telcos say that they're lacking enough funds and revenues in order to maintain the network, simply because in the old days, most of us have been using chat, text, emails, and so on, and now most of us basically use video as we use now, and it can use large quantities of the bandwidth. Now, on the top of this whole pyramid or this whole illustration, we basically have the regulators and policymakers or decision makers, which to some extent the regulators need to make sure that the competition is in place and to make the environment so that the competition can work, that we don't have a monopoly or dominance of any of the telecom providers. And on the other hand, we have governments and regulators and policymakers, governments first, which need to assure that the human rights, basic human rights, are respected, and basically they have the responsibility for the human rights. Now, this is a very brief introduction or review or overview of the open issues and key aspects of net neutrality discussion, whatever the way we define net neutrality, but these are the concerns. Let's dive a little bit into the prioritization. So we have two questions, why and how, that we can address shortly now. The first question is why telecom providers would be doing any kind of prioritization of the services. One reason is the technical. So in case there is a congestion of the network, simply there is too much traffic going on through the network and the pipes cannot physically support all the content that needs to flow through. And this is especially the case with mobile networks and wireless networks rather than with cables. In these cases, there might be a need to do a priority of certain packages. The pro-net neutrality advocates say, yes, that's fine, but let all different types or sources of information be treated the same way. The second reason of the technical aspect is the quality of service. And the third one is the emerging technologies, for instance, the Internet of Things, in which we are going to see machine-to-machine communication. Some of these machine-to-machine communications might need to have a priority, but then again, machine-to-machine communications are usually low bandwidth consumption communication, so that might not be such a problem, but that's something we need to see in future. The second reason would be the economic reason, and this is probably the cause of most of discussions and concerns when it comes to prioritization. As we have said before, the telcos say that they simply need more revenues in order to maintain the network, and they might need to build new economic models, so to speak. One way, of course, could be to request or re-challenge the current flat rate models and charges, or all one can eat. The other way is that the telecom providers can be favoring their own products, which has happened in a couple of instances around the world where telecom providers were also offering their own voice over IP or any other service, and they decided to throttle or to block Skype or the other competing technologies. And the second one is favoring partners products. As we mentioned, they can simply request Google, Hulu, Netflix, Facebook, or anyone else, or even any website on the net or any service that you might maintain on your own, to charge, to pay in order to get the priority. The more you pay, the greater the priority through the network you have. So those are in a way, the economic reasons, and then we have, of course, the legal reasons in case some kind of content is not legal or is a security problem and so on. But that's a totally different perspective, and we are not going to go into this. So the big question, the big open question is, okay, traffic management needs to be done, probably for technical reasons, for quality reasons, but where is the limit of the appropriate traffic management, and how can we define appropriate traffic management or prioritization of traffic? These are a couple of responses on the question of why. The question of how, and that's a very important one as well, how this kind of prioritization is technically made. One can be blocking, and we've mentioned cases of blocking certain types of traffic like Skype or whatever. The second one is throttling, which means slowing down in a way some types of traffic which are not the priority. I see the question from Deirdre. I'll get back to it later on about the definitions. We'll get back to discussing also possible different definitions between. So blocking, throttling, but the interesting new one, it's a new one, it's not so new of course, but there are new developments in the infrastructure, is accelerating the content that we might want to accelerate, or that the telecoms might want to accelerate. For instance, those of their partners like Google, Facebook, or whoever has been charged to have a faster lane. Now the good question is whether accelerating one type of content equals throttling out or throttling down the other type of content. One might discuss it that way, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. What I want to say is that accelerating some types of content creates inequity, but can also be beneficial to users. Where are the limits? That's the main dilemma. Let's go into this acceleration, how telecom providers or how the content on the net can be accelerated. And I'm using the recent illustration from a very recent Wired article, where this illustration is particularly interesting to show the developments in the infrastructure which have emerged maybe a couple of years ago and are now becoming very popular. And it is that the Google, Facebook, or your website or any other service offered on the net, while it can be connected to its own internet service provider, and then the internet service provider is connected to a backbone and then back to internet service to your internet service provider, and that's how you access it. There is also an option for those that have resources to connect, like Google, to connect directly to a big internet service provider, for instance, your internet service provider, which simply means that the traffic from Google is not going to go all around the net and then reach you, but it will go straight to your internet service provider, and it will simply become faster. So the latency of the data flow will be lower. So basically, you will get Google's traffic faster than if it would be traveling through the entire network. The other way, because Google obviously cannot really build up or connect directly to all the telecom providers around the world, it costs money. They can set up caching servers or content delivery network, which is basically data servers to some extent, in different telecom provider facilities around the world. So if they cannot connect to your telecom provider, they can simply provide copies of files on Google within your telecom provider. And again, when you're accessing Google, you will be able to access the local cache, which is updated from time to time. And that means the content, the Google content, will come to you faster than if it would be traveling around the world. Of course, anyone, including your small company, Twitter, Facebook, or any other service, can do the same. While building up the direct connection from Google to a telecom provider is expensive, putting up the servers might not be so expensive. And in fact, there are already, so to speak, commercial services like Cloudflare, which offer you, as a small company or anyone else, to rent some of these services or servers within telecom providers. So in a way, anyone with a bit or more or less money could afford better or a bit more accelerated service to the end users. Of course, the more money you have, the more you can invest in this infrastructure, and the better the service will be. But that's no doubt that the money simply turns, and Google can afford more than someone else. The point is that no one should be discriminated and not be available to the end users with a decent quality. Now, the main question in this dilemma, we are not going to go much into this and open the whole issue about peering. But one of the main dilemmas was what happens if telecom providers start charging Google or anyone else for this. So thus far, this has been for free, because telecoms basically had an interest to get direct connection to Google, Facebook, and the others, because their own customers could have better service. Now, if you have big telcos which have become a monopoly and they don't have a competition, they might start charging Google, charging Twitter or your service for all of this. And basically, you would need to pay in order to get this priority, to pay directly to the ISPs. Now, that's where we might have a problem, because someone might not be able to afford to pay additionally to telecom providers. And then again, the question is how telecom providers are going to make this kind of a cost scheme for anyone who wants to get a direct access to their network and their users. So this is the main dilemma where we can expect more and more discussions about what kind of internal payments for these specialized services or content development distribution network can be introduced. Now, from our perspective as the end users, we can say we don't really care. We don't care how they're going to share their revenues, the telcos and the OTTs or the content providers. What we care about is that we should, as the end users, should be able to have a reach to any kind of service offered on the internet with decent quality so that it's usable. Now that's what we as end users care, or that's what most of the proponents of net neutrality claim. I'll stop the technical part here and let me pass to the remaining couple of questions. One is, what has happened in the recent couple of months? We have seen the European Parliament, which has approved the regulation on the single telecom market. In the first instance, it didn't have any provision of net neutrality, or nothing so clear. At the end, the approved regulation has a definition of net neutrality, which again goes back to treating the packages equally, even if one needs to do traffic management. All the types of packages or all the origins of traffic needs to be treated equally, whether it's Google or it's my own email or whoever, needs to be treated equally. Then again, European Parliament also allows for specialized services, like special arrangements of telecom providers with content providers, OTTs, so that they have some specific kind of arrangement where they can pay more and have a better service. But, and this is very important, the European Parliament says that this should not go to the detriment of the internet as we know it. So in case we have specialized services, these should be something different from the current internet, and the current internet should not be endangered because of the new services. And that's quite an important thing to note. The second development is Brazilian Marco Civil, now the well-known template in a way for the local or the national law on internet, which, among other principles related to human rights, freedom of expression, freedom of access to information, and so on, clearly defines the network neutrality principle, and it also refers to data processing regardless of content, origin, and destination, so very similar to the one previously seen in the European Parliament, but also the one seen in the Dutch law and Slovenian law, Chilean law, and the other legislation that already exists. Marco Civil allows the management only due to technical reasons in emergency services, and there should be no discriminatory policy, no discriminatory behavior of the telecom provider. Then we have the NetMundial. We have discussed a lot of NetMundial in the previous months, but one of the key points of NetMundial outcome document is related to net neutrality. And while net neutrality principle was in the initial proposal, and Brazil was pushing strongly for it, at the end, Brazil and many others, in a way, gave up to this principle, but ended up in the network neutrality ended up in the last part of the document in a way to be discussed, or what NetMundial suggests that should be discussed further. And most importantly, NetMundial says that open internet as a principle has been prominent in the final document, but net neutrality per se should probably be discussed more, specifically appropriate network management and consumer choice, competition, transparency, and so on should be discussed more, and specifically at the IGF, and probably other fora that might emerge. In the US, we have seen the changes with the FCC. Well, the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, was the one previously to protect net neutrality, or try to protect it. It has firstly been overruled by the court that the FCC doesn't have the mandate to introduce net neutrality to the telecom providers, since they're treated as the information services rather than the common carriers. That's kind of the definition in the US. And secondly, the new leaders of the FCC have brought up the rules about the open internet, allowing, in a way, the specialized services, whereby FCC would be the one to decide what might be reasonable in sense of charges. What are the implications to developing countries? This is something that should be discussed more and more, and I, of course, encourage all of you to try to discuss it more and more, because this is something that has not been too much discussed. There's been a lot, and there are a lot of discussions about the US even Europe, there's not much about developing countries. And recently I've seen only one article which discusses Africa a little bit, and there was an article in Foreign Affairs journal recently touching upon developing countries, but not much. A couple of things we've seen previously that the consequences might be because of the limited bandwidth in the developing countries there, the priority services might actually be the one functional, while the slow lane might be simply unusable. And that means that some number of blogs, news, new websites, even new services that might emerge from developing countries might not have the chance to go through the net. This is specifically important for the countries without, so to speak, a democratic regions, where there are a number of groups fighting for greater human rights and freedom of expression. And in case the mainstream media, which might be able to offer or pay for their priority through the net, are the only media that go through, that means that the blogs and alternative video pages, video blogs and the others might not get through, which can have quite the consequences on freedom of speech and freedom of access to information in developing countries. And that's a big concern to have in mind while discussing net neutrality. The other possible implication of lack of net neutrality, or so to speak, following the new FCC, US FCC provisions, which allows the specialized services, is that the local internet service providers in developing countries might now say, wait, if the US can be the one to allow their telecom providers to charge Google, Hulu, Netflix, Facebook, whoever, and get money from them, then we, the telcos, and those are usually the incumbents, in developing countries can of course do the same. And they might come to an idea to also charge Google, Hulu, and the others, which might be good for the economy of the local countries. But we might end up with a patchwork of different arrangements and so on, which might not be really clear. And definitely discrimination might be an issue there, which all should be discussing and checking through. The third implication might be totally opposite, that some countries, and we've seen already Europe, adopting net neutrality principles and saying, hey folks, Google, Facebook, and the others, if you have a problem that the US telecom operators want to charge you, we are not going to. So just come to our market and work from our market. And that might be one pattern where developing countries might also think of and say, now, okay, if we bring net neutrality regulation, we might, in a way, offer to host the previously US companies, which might find it beneficial. Now, these are a lot of possible implications. There are many more, and I again encourage you to discuss it. But this is something that should be discussed, and we hope that the next IGF will have a lot of space for this as well. And lastly, before we open up for discussion with you and questions, comments, is what is the open issues? What is appropriate traffic management? What are the specialized services? How can we assure the competition so that we avoid the dominance of certain internet service providers, as is mostly the case in the US, but not only? Is the choice and competition enough, or regulation needs to go hand in hand with choice and competition, which can definitely go hand in hand? But is it needed? How can we assure human rights as well as innovation, both in services and infrastructure? Now, these are very broad questions, but basically this is something where we are trying to find the compromise or the compromising line. What are the prospects? In the US, we are going to see which side is going to prevail, whether this kind of a loose approach to specialized services as FCC is doing now, or the push to reclassify the telecom providers as common carriers so that the FCC can introduce and, in a way, enforce net neutrality protection in US as well. In the EU, even though we have the European Parliament which has approved the regulation, the final step in it to become operational is the Council, the European Council, that needs to approve it. Because of the elections in Europe, it is expected, if it happens, that it will probably happen by the end of this year or early next year. While the European body of regulators for electronic communications, BEREC, has already been quite clear in the sense of non-discrimination policies and competition among telecom providers in Europe. The Internet Governance Forum, taking place in Istanbul 2nd to 5th of September this year, will most likely have net neutrality session, one of the main sessions, 3-hour sessions, as a follow-up to Net Mundial, and we'll discuss this session just after the webinar with a number of colleagues from the MAG of the IGF, and we'll try to propose a good outline, and we encourage you all to get involved and help us shape the discussion in the right way at the IGF, and of course take part in this discussion. And there are many other initiatives, one of which will be Council of Europe, new push on net neutrality principles. I think we might have Luca Belli with us later on here to brief us what happened with Council of Europe and what can we expect. This is it about the overview. It was more or less half an hour, as I promised. I open the floor to questions, and I see that there is already quite a number of questions. Before I move to questions, I just want to check if maybe Luca Belli is here. Luca, are you with us? If you are, let me see, Luca is probably not with us still. Anyhow, if he joins us at some point, we might see more what's happening with the Council of Europe. But in the meantime, let me try to go through the questions. I will read them one by one, and we'll also try to reflect. I also encourage you, if you have responses to the questions of your colleagues, to try to respond. So, were the questions from this is a comment from Ginger to Diedre based on the definitions of various aspects of internet governance, including Net Mundial, where Ginger says, Diedre, sometimes those multiple definitions of different challenges seem to be at the convenience of the speaker, especially of the telecoms. Is this true, rather? I would say that this is particularly interesting in the debate about net neutrality. We have seen, on one hand, many advocacy groups opting for net neutrality, while not going into too many details about explaining what this means or what kind of package prioritization would be allowed, because some evidently needs to be and has always been done for technical reasons. So to some extent, even the advocacy groups have not always explained what they mean by net neutrality. On the other hand, we have seen telecom providers saying that net neutrality is the solution in search of a problem. Meaning in a way that there is no such thing as net neutrality, but there is a main question of the competition of telecom providers. There are many nuances of this grade. So in between, I hope we have managed to at least open up this Pandora box on possible nuances in between. Anderson says, what is or are the consequences to the end users when the internet service providers are favoring their own products? This has happened in a number of occasions, including in Europe. And there are some reports from BEREC where they explain a number of cases where the internet service providers have been either throttling or blocking certain types of content. For instance, blocking Skype in their networks, and especially in their mobile networks, simply because if one can be able to use Skype in a mobile network through the 3G technology for free to communicate with someone else over voice, That means that, and that would probably be much cheaper than using the minutes in the network. That means that this is a competition to an offer of a telecom provider, and the telecom provider might simply say this is not in our commercial interest. So they might do, in a way, the anti-competitive measures. That's what happens when the internet service provider prioritize its own service. Now, what happens if the internet service providers prioritize specialized services or some services that have been additionally paid, like Google or the others, is what we said back at the beginning with this illustration, that if you have a fast lane and a slow lane without a clear discussion or agreement how fast lane and slow lane are created, it can basically happen that some applications or some services in networks which are congested or do not have bigger bandwidth cannot go through. The quality of service will be lousy, and you might, for instance, end up with let's say the video blog or the videos from a particular country somewhere in Africa, which does not go to YouTube but to some local website, that can be cut and you can not really see them. This is the way Ginger used to explain it, and it's really a good explanation of this, which means it's unusable. So that's something we need to be cautious. If we have a fast lane and a slow lane, which might be needed for innovative services, we need to know how these two are created and what are the consequences, and we need to be sure that the slow lane is still sufficiently good that the end users can effectively have some use of it. Abdul Halim Sulaima asked that he cannot truly understand the Google peering. I will not spend too much time. It's a very, very complicated issue, but let me just briefly repeat so that it might be more clear. What Google can do in order to accelerate its own traffic, it can effectively connect directly to a telecom provider, cable, really a cable, from Google to Comcast. Comcast is the US telecom provider. If they have ability or enough funds, they can lay the cable, connect from Google to Comcast, so that all the users of Comcast, which is an internet service provider, do not need to get to Google's content through internet, but directly from Google to their own internet service provider and to our computers. Now, this is obviously the case only where it is possible to physically lay the cable from Google or Facebook or whatever to an internet service provider, right? Where it's not possible, Google can set up the content delivery network or the caching servers, the servers which contain the copies of mostly used Google files, and they place these servers in telecom providers. So basically, it's more or less effective, more or less the same. Instead of you as the user need to go through the internet service provider somewhere to the net in order to get Google, and that Google traffic flows very slowly all around the world to get to you, you simply get straight to the servers which are in your internet service provider facilities. And of course, Google traffic will come much faster. Same with YouTube, same with any other who has funds to afford to build up such an infrastructure. Now, building up an infrastructure is one thing. That's one part of the investment for Google or YouTube. But if telecom providers would now say, this is not enough, you also have to pay us for this, that means additional burden in order to get your traffic accelerated at Google or someone else. For Google, probably it wouldn't be an issue to pay both for this infrastructure and to give some cash to the telecom providers to allow them to do so. For some small, new, emerging services, they might be able, maybe, if they need, to rent content delivery network or something according to the capacity they might need. But it's a question whether they would be able to pay additionally to telecom providers all around the world to do the same. So that's where the unequal competition might occur, and that means, yes, we are really right, that YouTube might be the only one, or CNN or BBC, might be the only one who is practically reachable in some distant part of the world where the bandwidth is not good enough. I hope this explains a little bit. It's still, I'm sure, quite gray, but we need a separate webinar to go back into technical details, and we might actually do something with the Geneva Internet Platform, the whole day event, to try to go with different aspects of both infrastructure and net neutrality. Arsen says, it is a great danger if there is no more space for new blogs or new websites. Freedom of expression is in danger, and as a blogger, I will always fight against this. I suggest Diplo and GIP to host a session on net neutrality with young people to better discuss this and make some concrete suggestions to telcos and internet service providers. Thank you, Arsen. This is a very good suggestion. When it comes to freedom of expression, the effect of this kind of priority of different services or of dominant services which might actually have funds to pay for priority services, as I said, can be particularly visible in developing countries now. This argument of not having new websites or new blogs specifically for freedom of expression is sometimes discussed by the telecom operators in the following way. They say, well, listen, the fact that we are going to charge Google for accelerated services does not necessarily mean we are going to charge everyone. And certainly does not necessarily mean that we are going to charge everyone with the same rate. So we might adjust the rates based on your needs. At the end, not everyone might need to have the accelerated services if the slow lane is good enough. And exactly that is what the proponents of net neutrality, or even the European Parliament regulation now, tries to define, that even if there is a fast track, that the slow tracks should still be good enough so that we can access it with a meaningful quality. In practice, that might mean that if you want to watch the new series of House of Cards show from Hulu or Netflix with high definition video, it might go as smooth as it would the small low definition video from the local website in Egypt. Now, whether that's going to really happen, or the specialized services might endanger the slow track of the internet, making it unuseful so that the video cuts, the local video cuts, that's a good question. And that's something where the devil is in detail. That's something we really need to discuss at the IGF and in the other fora, how to make sure that the services on the internet on the slow track, where people do not have additional funds to invest, they just have an idea and a couple of servers to build up, that they can still do amazing job and access all around the world with decent quality to anyone. This is something that is very linked to human rights. This is linked to freedom of expression, to freedom of access to information, and all the other things that a particular Council of Europe is working on. I hope I managed to give you a more clear picture on this. Deirdre Williams says, several years ago, the US proposed a new fast research network running parallel to the internet. The UK has Janet, which I think is similar. How does this type of initiative factor into the mix? And this is where the devil is. So if you get back to the European Parliament regulation, the European Parliament basically says that when they set the condition for specialized services, they say this is optimized for specific content application services and so on. Then they say allowed only if there is network capacity in addition to internet and provided over logically distinct capacities. It doesn't necessarily mean, and it's a question if it means or it should mean, that this different capacity, as you say, Ginger, is physically a different cable. After all, what it means a physically different cable. From Europe to US, the underwater cables that go, this is not just one cable, this is a bunch of optical cable, fiber optic cables. So what does it mean adding a new cable? And alternatively, the EU says, or the European Parliament says logically distinct capacity. This should also be defined. What does that mean? But there is probably one very important aspect which the European Parliament says. It should not go to the detriment of the quality, and it should not be a substitute to the Internet access service. So probably this is something that we should stick to, or the European Parliament will probably, European Union will stick to, whatever the way technically it is realized, whatever even the financial arrangements are between peering between telecoms and content providers. For European Union, it will probably be important that it is not to the detriment of the Internet access service or Internet as we know, and it is not a substitute to it. So that's back to what we discussed. Rahul Sharma says, my question to the panelists is how can net neutrality in principle and spirit be implemented whilst allowing Internet service providers to innovate and earn so that access to free content is not impacted? Rahul, I would probably be in the Internet Hall of Fame if I would be able to respond to your question now. But I would say that the aspects that are discussed currently are what is the way to enforce, if nothing else, than this principle that the European Union said, or the principle related to discrimination, whatever this discrimination may mean, and that's something that should probably be defined more, as they say, sender, recipient type, content device, and so on. The way to protect this kind of principles, and this is if we say that net neutrality should be these principles which we as users observe, that there is no discrimination, that our internet as we know is not impacted negatively but only positively, and we as the users are the ones to say if this is positive or not, then what is the way to enforce this? The telecom providers would say competition. The only thing we need is competition, which means the more internet service providers we have, the greater the possibility for users to just change internet service provider whenever they don't like it, the more there is a chance that an internet service provider will realize that the interests of citizens is not to offer just some services, but everything. So you just switch to someone who offers everything. That's what usually the telecom providers would say. The regulatory authority results is, including Europe and especially US, where there is a lack of competition among telecom providers, and there is kind of a big monopoly. The results of regulatory authorities says that the competition does not exist really in practice, and that in practice currently users cannot switch the internet service provider within a day, but much more. This is much worse in developing countries, which means this does not really probably fly at the moment. There is no competition. And that's why the regulators usually push for competition, and even policies and regulations and law to some extent when it comes to competition. Now, protecting the principles as we underline in yellow, or as Council of Europe puts it on and so on, might need competition, but this might not be enough. I wrote a blog some time ago, and you can find a link where I tried to explain that the choice is not enough, which means it's not enough to be able to make or it's not enough to have the choice, even if we have the choice to change the internet service provider. But we as end users, and it's almost 3 billion of us now, each one of us has to be able to make the right choice. Ability to make a choice requires understanding of different options, understanding of the legal terms of references and agreements that we are signing with telecom providers, understanding of possible consequences, what can happen. Not only that, of course, we need the transparency of telecom providers so that we know what they really offer within their offer. And lastly, what about new generations? Let's say you can offer Facebook for free to the students, and the students do not have really funds to pay for much more, so they'll be happy to have Facebook for free. Well, this is good, of course, because they save the money. That means that they might not ever be able to see that there is something else than Facebook. They might not be able to see that there are some blogs or some webinars like that or something else even which is for free, because this is not for free, and they just pay the package for Facebook. So we have to be very cautious about the consequences of this. Now, back to your question, how do we assure that all this is respected, whether the competition is enough, or the regulation to enforce competition is necessary ex ante, not ex post, so in advance, or whether really the law is needed, as it is the case now in Netherlands, Slovenia, Luxembourg, Chile, and many other countries, Brazil, or whether the policies on a global level or regional level, like the ones that Council of Europe is working on, are needed. That's something that needs to be discussed. So the policy and regulatory mechanisms, something that needs to be discussed, and it probably depends from one market to another. In one market, it might be needed, the law is there. In others, the regulation. In some, the competition can work. That's a billion-dollar question, and it depends from ground to ground, I would say. Rahul, your second question is how can net neutrality in principle inspire? No, the second question, sorry, this one is that you already asked for. Please explain the concept of prioritizing or slowing down traffic, offline flowing. Data travels at constant rate. We cannot slow down the package flow rate by slowing down the traffic. We need to reduce bandwidth. I'll get back to, yes, reduction of the bandwidth, and in a way, prioritizing the packages. Now, what I mentioned when I said how packages can be prioritized, I'll get one step back, which is why. And we always, or this has always been done, the prioritization of packages, meaning accelerating certain types of packages. Fatima, I'll get back to it. Thank you for the note. Prioritizing certain types of packages like video or voice over text has always been done. The routers are not dumb equipment. They're quite smart. So for quality of service, priority of packages has always been technically done for technical means and technical needs. Congestion is something that has not always been done, or we didn't used to always have it. Now, when we have a heavy load of traffic, especially high definition videos, congestion might occur. And in these circumstances, it might be needed to prioritize certain types of traffic and maybe slow down the other type of traffic. Simply the real-time communications needs to be prioritized. The asynchronous communications might not need to be, because you will not really notice the delay. But when it comes to how the acceleration of the packages can be done also, as we said, by shortening the latency of the network, which means shortening the time that certain package needs to travel from content providers to us, which means shortening the road, the destination that these packages need to travel. And this is done by shortcutting, either through direct communications or connections peering between content providers and telecom providers, if this is possible, or by putting copies of content of Google, YouTube, or whoever within these content delivery networks close or at the facilities of telecom providers. So we basically cut it shorter for packages, and that's the way we accelerate it. So that's in a way prioritization, which might not necessarily be bad, of course. I lost somewhere Fatima's question. Rather, how are we going to keep discussing network neutrality in the IGF? Do you think we also discuss the topic at the local level? Yes, there should be discussions at the local level, at the regional IGFs, of course, between different stakeholders, of course, and at the IGF, we are going to try to put up an outline of the proposal for the main session of the September IGF. And Fatima, if you're willing, since you're a Magnum member also, please help us. As soon as we put up the basic construction, we'll open up for anyone to comment. So it will be we'll try to be really, really transparent on how we are going to discuss it. One question, I think it's a final question from Peter. Respond to Deirdre Williams. Peter says research networks, as Janet in UK and GEANT in EU, Internet 2 in US, are private networks and have no connection to the public commercial networks ISPs, and therefore are not relevant in the debate on net neutrality. So this is a very good point, that when we build another network, as long as it is logically disconnected, as the Europeans would say, from the current internet, we can probably be safe that it's not going to, well, whether we can or not be safe that it's not going to endanger internet as we know it is a question. This says to Peter, thank you. However, I thought we were all very anxious to maintain one internet and prevent the service from breaking. Yes, what Peter was referring to is basically creating the networks which would not be, so to speak, at this point, widely used. They would be used for specific purposes between different, usually enterprises and so on, but might not be necessarily needed for the end users. So that's different. But at some point, they might end up all together. So we might see, in a way, different new services coming up again to end users, and you're right. We might end up seeing either a new internet, a second internet, or an upgraded internet. The point of any of these will be that we could still have the internet as we have it, open with access to everything with decent quality. So that would be, in a way, the bottom line. And one last comment from Rahul Sharma: given constant bandwidth, does latency improvement for one application mean latency degradation for other services automatically? Not necessarily. That means if you cut the road for the packages so that they do not have to travel longer, that means they're faster. But it doesn't mean necessarily that the others will be slowed down. But ultimately, you're right. It depends on the bandwidth that we have. In the congested networks, everything will matter because it really depends what comes to you at the end, right? With what speed. So in the congested network, it might result, the congestion per se might result that the other packages that are not fast enough might be too slow to be used. Okay, I have one more question from Gonzalo. If prioritization is not to be permitted so that all users have same opportunities, is then direct peering and content delivery networks are to be prohibited as just big pocket companies can afford it? This is one of the questions which we need to dive in more. Telecom providers, even some content providers, would say that this is not bad, let's say, that the fact that you can set up a content delivery network for a peering, as we said, can effectively accelerate some type of content. So you might be able to consume Google and the big ones more quickly, which would be an improved experience for end users, while it wouldn't necessarily be a worse experience with other services. They would just load equally slow if the connection is more or less good, right? Unless there is a congestion on the network. But the fact is, and there is an additional fact that I mentioned, there are now private content delivery. So these are the private content delivery networks that Google is building. Google is setting up servers in telecom providers. Now, there are other public content delivery networks which are available to anyone. Cloudflare has one. So if you have small service on the net, but you have enough users already and some revenues, you want to invest and improve your connection, you will of course build your new servers and so on. You can rent some of the content delivery network parts from public offers like Cloudflare. So you don't really have to have that much money to build your own content delivery network, but you can rent it. The more you need, the more you rent. At some point when you become Google, you might build your own. Some services might not even need it because they don't have so many users. They just don't need it, right? But then again, it is a question of what comes if the telecom providers start charging everyone for this, the companies for this. What if telecom providers start charging Google for this peering and for placing content delivery network in their facilities? It's a big question how this pricing model would be made, who could be able to pay, what would be the consequences, and so on. Maybe this can be solved by the market. Maybe this needs some kind of regulation or to control the monopolies and so on. So that's quite a big question. Gonzalo says, no, that's the one. And then we have from Nick. Nick says, is it important that productive discussion on network neutrality takes place in the IGF and other IG spaces before network neutrality becomes a major talking point at World Trade Organization? This is an interesting question, and I think very useful. And it boils down to broader internet governance discussions. It is, are there existing institutions, international institutions like WTO, which might effectively take part or even offer policy documents in certain discussion areas about internet governance? There's a lot of discussion about that. We've seen last week ICANN talking about Network Mondial Alliance, which might be something like that. We've seen CSTD recommendations about mapping what other existing institutions might have with internet governance and so on. The IGF is definitely currently the only space where the open discussions, multi-stakeholder discussions take place. And in that sense, it would definitely be useful. The bigger discussions occur at the IGF as well, even some recommendations, best practices, whatever, some outcomes. At the workshops, we have had workshops in the IGF thus far many times, but this would be probably the first time where the IGF would respond to the main session as well, if it happens. Now, when it comes to the WTO, it is interesting to discuss whether some aspects of competition regulation might be driven at the WTO. On the other hand, some aspects of the human rights, in sense of the availability of information and access to information and freedom of expression, so this kind of the end user experience level, could be linked to the UN system, which is dealing with the human rights, so the Human Rights Council. or with the Council of Europe work on human rights and so on. There's many levels, technical, economic, and human rights levels, which might be probably linked to different aspects and probably dealt with different institutions in different regulatory approaches, law, policy, soft law, agreements, open competition, and so on. I wouldn't say there is a silver bullet. I would say there is a lot of nuances and fine-tuning also depending on locals and regional needs. But it's something that needs to be explored more, and some best practices would be very important, including, for instance, hearing from the Dutch, Slovenians, Europe in some years, Brazil and the others, which have the law now. How does it impact? Is it a positive or a negative impact to both innovation and user? I will stop it here. We did break some minutes through the agenda. I'm very happy for all the questions, and I hope I managed to shed some more light. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for joining us. We will try to continue this discussion, especially within the Geneva Internet platform, with some events in Geneva, with some more webinars. And on behalf of some of the members of the MAG that are working on the IGF proposal for the session in Istanbul, will definitely keep you involved, keep you informed and involved if you're willing to take part in it. I'm sure Internet Governance Forum website will also inform about what's happening, and please be involved and help us, including during the IGF in Istanbul in September. Thank you all for joining. The webinar recording will be available soon on our website, and I think the IG webinars and the GIP webinars will continue somewhere from September. So follow the website of GIP and Diplo and catch up together again from September. Thank you. Bye.